Welcome to Sinister Black Echoes, where we'll share horror stories that make your skin crawl. Today we have one short story. I can confidently say this is the creepiest story we have done so far. It is about a run-in with a cult of some sort in a rural town. Unfortunately, the townsfolk weren't able to catch the cult members. Or were they part of the cult? Stay tuned to find out what happens.
I actually have several stories to share if you're interested, all true and all creepy. I'll start with this particular story because it haunts me to this day. Over 20 years after it happened. I was about 21 or 22 when this happened. I was in the military at Fort Sill and didn't know it, but Desert Storm was right around the corner. At the time, I lived in south-central Oklahoma on the outskirts of a small town called Duncan. I was helping a friend round up some cattle that got out because someone had run across a T-section and went through their fence. It tore 2 posts down and left a 30-foot section open for the cattle to get out. We'd already found most of the cattle and were missing another 3 or 4, so we were out at 1 a.m. on dirt bikes trying to find them before someone hit one of them and sued his father. My friend and I went east, and the other guys went north and south. One thing you need to understand about Oklahoma is that most of it farmed, either cattle or crops. It is also divided into 1-mile sections for the most part. In other words, the roads all run north and south or east and west and intersect at 1-mile intervals. If you ask directions for something out in the country, you are more likely than not to get instructions that include, go 3-mile sections north and then 2-mile sections west. The area at this time was sparse and there weren't many homes. We didn't know how long the hole had been in the fence. My friend's father only checked the fence because he was missing livestock. They owned the entire mile section and a good portion of the adjoining mile section. The hole in the fence was on the east side of their land, at the furthest distance from their house. They checked the fence for such holes on a weekly basis, so the hole could not have been more than 2 days old. James and I were riding on these old dusty, dirt roads with battery-powered spotlights to both show the way and to search for cattle. We'd stop at any of the million small wooden bridges and look to see if there were any cows down by the water. Our plan was to go out 10 miles and then go over a mile section and drive back 10 miles until we'd gone a total of 10 miles out and 10 miles over. Then we were to do it all again but on the north/south roads instead of the east/west roads. If you were to plot at a map, it would be a 10 by 10 grid. We had been at it since before 9 p.m., just as it was getting dark, and we'd already gone 10 miles out and about 3 miles over. I need to mention at this point there are some mile sections that are not divided by roads and you have to turn one way or another at a T intersection. If that happens, we always took the road that went in our general direction of travel. If we were traveling east and came to a T, and we'd already checked the road north of us, then we'd head to the south a mile and then head east again. Occasionally, an old farmer would pass away and leave his land to relatives who had no interest in farming, and the land would be put up for sale or just left alone for years. When this happens and the roads aren't used as much, nature reclaims them and you're usually left with a dirt road with weeds and grass growing on it, or you're left with little more than an improved trail, usually 2 ruts with overgrown weeds and Johnson grass and occasionally a tree. We were on one of the rutted roads, headed south to the next intersection where we'd turn east again. The land here was too hilly for cultivation and had been left alone for at least the last 30 years. We were both familiar with it and we hunted and fished there. This mile section and the next 2 were basically wild. At the end of the dirt trail would be a T intersection, but the west side was fenced, and the only option was to turn east again. At the end of this mile section, the road was a dead end, but we had to check it and the double back. We just made the turn back to the east when we saw something burning over the next rise. Grass fires are extremely dangerous and can get out of control in minutes. As we topped the rise, we saw the fire was actually in the middle of the dirt road. When we got to it, we found that it was a recliner that was burning. A blue Lazaboy recliner. We stopped and threw some dirt on it and finally got it extinguished. James and I was wondering what kind of an idiot would do this and how strange it was to be in the middle of the road just burning. Satisfied that the fire was out, we got back on our bikes and idled past the recliner toward the end of the mile section, still a quarter of a mile in the distance. We found one of their cows at the bottom of the rise, about 100 feet down the road. It was laying in half out of the road. Its throat had been cut and it was laying there with its eyes opened and tongue hanging out. There was blood everywhere. As we were looking at it and trying to figure out what happened, James said, "Hey, look at this," and showed me where the blood had dripped from the cow to about 10 feet away from it. There were shoe prints of blood in the road. It was just part of a shoe print, but you could tell that was a shoe print. We found 2 more when we looked more diligently. At this point, the hairs on the back of my neck were standing up and it was suddenly a very cool evening. I looked at James and his eyes were as big as saucers. He thought something spooky was happening too. We talked about going back, but we knew that we'd be shamed if we didn't see if there was anything else. We finally decided to walk the bikes the rest of the way to the dead end just in case there was someone there. We didn't want them to hear the engines. We began walking the last quarter mile or so to the dead end. It was at the base of the last hill, and we just started heading up it on the other side. My heart was going about 200 miles an hour and I had cotton mouth so bad that it was almost impossible to swallow. Then I noticed that someone had stuck paper plates to the barbs of the wire of the fence. We looked and there were plates stuck to the top strand of wire on both sides of the road. It started about 50 feet behind us and continued up and over the hill. They were evenly spaced about 5 feet apart. As our gaze followed the row of paper plates up the top of the hill, James suddenly said, "There's another fire," and it was at that moment that I could smell it. But what I smelled wasn't that normal smoky smell, it was as though someone had added incense to it. I asked James if he could smell that, and he could. I told him that I didn't like this at all. I was okay with losing face in front of our friends and his dad and brothers. I was ready to go. He agreed with me but said that we had to see what was burning. We were both whispering, and we were both shaking so much that our voices quavered. We started up the hill again and I was thinking with every step that we were going to be seriously killed or worse. As we got to the top of the hill, one of the paper plates blew off the fence and skittered behind us, making both of jump, and it was all I could do not to scream. After we saw what it was, I started to laugh it off, but James shushed me and told me to listen. We could hear voices. As we topped the hill and were able to see the bottom where the road stopped, we saw a group of about 10 people all standing around another recliner that was burning. They had their backs to us and they were passing a big pitcher around. From our vantage point, we couldn't actually see what was in the pitcher. But the slit throat of the cow haunted my thoughts. They would each take a mouthful and spit it into the fire. This went on until the pitcher was empty. The entire time, they were all saying something in unison. We could only understand an occasional word. They changed their tones in a rhythmic manner with an emphasis on the last word. I can remember hearing, "here and there," and "beseech," and "Father," James and I stood there on top of that hill like a couple of idiots. Our mouths hanging wide open and actually scared stiff. After a minute or two, they would repeat whatever it was, all the while passing that pitcher and spitting into the fire. There was a small camp table set up on the side and little behind them. After the last of the liquid was gone, a man turned and sat the pitcher on the table and picked up what looked like a large loaf of bread. Just as he was turning back to the fire, he evidently saw us. I am sure that we made a nice silhouette sitting there at the top of the hill. He screamed, "Hey," and dropped the loaf of bread and started running in our direction. The others turned and immediately followed him. That was all the encouragement that we needed. It was time to go. We turned our bikes around. James got his started on the first kick, but I somehow managed to get myself off balance, and when I kicked, the bike fell on its side with me. By this time, I was near panic and was breathing in raspy short breaths. I picked the bike up again and tried to start it, but it didn't start. I thought about running, but we were out in the middle of nowhere. I finally started pushing the motorcycle down the other side of the hill and jumped on it. It seemed like it took forever to get enough speed, but I popped the clutch and it started. James was waiting at the corner of the intersection to make sure that I was coming. And we headed for his house, going way too fast for safety, especially in the dark. When we finally got back to his house, we told his dad what we'd seen. His dad called a couple friends and they all loaded up in their trucks with enough weapons to start a small war. James and I sat with his dad and told him where to turn. His dad kept asking us questions on the way. What were they doing? Why was there a chair on fire? They cut the cow's throat. How many were there? What did they look like? What were they driving? That last question stumped us. We hadn't seen any cars or trucks. The road was the only way in or out, and there was a creek that ran on the back side of the end of that particular road, so they couldn't have gone that direction. How had they gotten there with two recliners? When we got to that last stretch of road, the headlights found the spot where the recliner had been sitting. It was gone. We could all see where the road and surrounding grass was burned, but the recliner was not there. As we got closer, James noticed that the cow was gone too. I hate to admit, but I was getting scared all over again. I was afraid that his dad would tell us that it was our imagination and not believe us. When we got closer to the burnt spot in the road, Buster, James' dad, noticed the chair off in the ditch on the left side of the road. Then I noticed the cow on the other side. It was also in the ditch. The paper plates were all gone. Buster got out to look at the cow with the other men. They stood there talking and shaking their heads for what seemed like 10 minutes before getting back into the trucks. We continued toward the hill. The ruts made by spinning motorcycle tires were easily seen, but there was no fire on the other side of the hill. We all went down to where the other recliner had been burning, but it and the camp table were gone. You could see where someone had walked around the charred area and covered it with dirt. After we left, James saw a paper plate about 50 feet on the other side of the fence. Buster called the county sheriff when we got home, and by that time it was daylight, and we went out again with the sheriff and a deputy. When we got back to the road, the first recliner and the cow were gone, but you could still see where something had been on fire, and there was still blood on the road and in the grass. James showed them the shoe prints we'd seen. At the bottom of the hill, you could still see the charred area where the second recliner had been burning, and the deputy found little scuff marks where the table had been sitting. At the end of the road, you could see where the top strand of the fence had been tugged down and wrapped around the lower strand so someone could crawl over it. You could also see where the grass and weeds had been trampled, providing a fairly easy trail to follow. We found a woman's tennis shoe on the other side of the creek. You could see where someone had climbed up the bank on the far side of the creek. We followed the trail all the way across the field up to the next dirt road. Again, the top wire was wrapped around the next lower wire, and there was a piece of red bandana-looking material caught in it. There were marks on the road where 2 or 3 different cars had spun their tires when they left. Buster also found a large piece of glass that had blood on it. Buster filed a report for the missing cow. They'd found 4 more cows in the opposite direction from where me and James had gone. They never found the recliners or the missing cow. The sheriff called a few days later and told Buster that the blood on the glass was human and not bovine. It was his guess that the pitcher broke and someone cut their hand while carrying it back to their vehicles. 2 weeks after that, there was a huge scare in our community about some cult that had promised the area at large that they were going to sacrifice a blonde-haired virgin girl and boy. Buster always said that it was just someone running their mouth after hearing about our incident. It was all anyone talked about that summer. Buster also said that he sure liked to know what happened to that cow. Sorry it was so long. I got chill bumps while remember all of this. This happened in 1988 to 89 and I still think about it. Tell me if you want to read some of the other creepers I have.
And that wraps up this video. To all of you who have followed along on this journey, thank you for joining us in this adventure. If you would like to hear more in the future, please like and subscribe. Your support and enthusiasm mean the world to us. Until next time,